Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's September 20th today, Thursday, and we're going to talk about two main astrological events. Briefly, we're going to talk about the fact that Mars is currently conjoining the South Node again for the third and final time, moving through the same degrees that it covered when it was retrograde. So that's the first thing that we're going to talk about. But the real focus of today is going to be on giving a little preview of Venus retrograde. So Venus will be turning retrograde on October 6th in the sign of Scorpio, around 10 degrees, and will be retrograde for about 40 days, all the way into about the middle of November. So the big focus of today's talk will be on Venus retrograde in Scorpio. What can you expect or look forward to with this transit, and maybe some thoughts about how to deal with the things that are likely to come up during a Venus retrograde in general, and then more specifically a Venus retrograde in Scorpio. So, but like I said, before we dive into that, let's talk a little bit about the fact that Mars is getting back together with the South Node of the Moon once again. This is the third and final time. And if you've noticed, for example, watched the news lately, you've probably seen, I live in Maryland, not far from where I live right now. There was just I guess a active shooter, and several people, I believe, have had their lives taken again by an act of gun violence. This is happening all the time now, it seems. But you may have noticed that over the last few days, there's been several of them. There was one in Wisconsin. There was one in Pennsylvania. I don't know if I'm missing some other one, but there was one obviously today in Maryland. And I've gotten a number of questions saying, are these like events, these shootings, are they correlated to anything astrological? And it's not my favorite topic, because obviously it's just turn on the news and you have enough gloom and doom every day to fill you up. But it is important to learn how to see astrological correlation, and obviously people's questions and concerns about the current events and the way that they correspond with the astrology are valid. So I wanted to say something about that today. Mars and the South Node of the Moon are difficult together. They can be. So let's talk about that. First of all, Mars conjoining the South Node of the Moon for the third time. Let's just review. Last spring, Mars entered the sign of Aquarius about the middle of May, and over the course of the next month went through a long, slow conjunction with the South Node of the Moon, and then turned retrograde, went back over, and throughout July and August came through a conjunction again via retrograde with the South Node of the Moon. Stationed in late August, is moving forward again now in Aquarius, and is making a final conjunction to the South Node of the Moon. So this has been a back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And for many of us, with the Mars retrograde theme added on, we've been dealing with issues around agitation, anger, our sense of willpower, and whether or not we feel we're effective in using our will, or whether we feel that we are getting the job done or getting the results that we want, or the outcomes that we desire, and frustration potentially involved with those things. A revision of how we think about and use our will, or our freedom. There's also oftentimes elements of conflict and themes of both power and disempowerment in relationships that are involved with a long period of kind of studying Mars. And so that's been going on ever since the middle of May. For most of us, Mars has been very pronounced. And you can look in your chart especially at the whole sign house of Aquarius, or the first, say, 10 degrees of Aquarius, to get a feeling for where, what topics or what area of your life this Mars retrograde theme has been active. And you can look at the topics of the houses. That's an easy way of doing it. So you could say we've all been on a kind of personal journey with Mars. And as Mars has been in close proximity with the south node of the moon the entire time, there's been another set of themes that have been prominent. Now, the south node of the moon, for those who do not know, is related to it's a point. In Indian astrology, it's thought of as an actual sort of shadow planet, but it's a point that the moon crosses each month when it is weaving its path around the zodiac. And as it goes down toward the south, descending, it will cross the ecliptic path of the sun and head toward the southern horizon before lifting up again and crossing at the opposite nodal point, the north node or the ascending node, and then cross above the ecliptic, going up above in the sky, sort of more toward the pole star, up toward the north. So that's happening all the time. The moon's always weaving that pattern. And it actually, when you see the moon weaving, crisscrossing around the ecliptic path of the sun, you get a sense for why the moon was, and the nodes of the moon were associated with the head and tail of a dragon. It has a serpentine or serpentine-like way that it weaves in relation to the sun. And that weaving of the moon as it's sloughing off its skin, so to speak, its light every month, has a kind of serpent-like quality. Well, what is the serpent related to? In many different, we'll just say, religious, mythic traditions on our planet, the serpent is one of the quintessential images for terrestrial life, life on Earth. Because everything here, the nature of life on Earth, is change and impermanence. And so everything as a constant, everything as a reflection of change in this world is like the moon. So you could think of the change of the seasons. You could think of the change of your moods. You can think of the change of physical things on a chemical level or in your body, the oceans and the tides. But everything is constantly in this flux and flow, and this can't step in the same river twice kind of feeling. That's what permeates our existence here on Earth. And most mystical traditions that we all know of, the big ones anyway, they address this. The problem of human life begins in some ways with this recognition that things are always changing and it's very difficult to deal with. And so the moon is a reflective light that suggests our condition in this world. Eternity is here in our midst. It's reflected here in all of the changes. We see it, we see glimmers of it, but you can't hold on to it because it's always moving and always changing. And we go mad sometimes, as the moon was connected to lunacy and madness. We actually can go mad in trying to hold on to things here, or in trying to locate our happiness in material things that keep slipping through our hands like sand. So the nodes of the moon are very important points that refer to critical junctures of karmic change, or what could be said as, in less esoteric terms, as significant moments where the constant flux and transformations of material life are changing more dramatically, and they're either changing toward the ascending sense, they're either changing in the sense of ascending, or they're changing in the sense of descending. And there were general meanings that ancient astrologers associated with whether fortune, or the material world of karma and action and reaction, was going up or whether it was going down. Of course, when fortune is going up, you have a general association with the planet Jupiter and the North Node. And so fortune expands, things grow and proliferate. Jupiter is considered to be a benefic. The benefics are connected with fertility in ancient astrology, especially in plant life. So when fortune rises, and the North Node of the moon is indicated with this rising of fortune, things expand. But there's an esoteric statement that was pretty common amongst ancient Western astrologers, which was that the North Node increased both the good and the bad. And so you have to be careful, because in this world of material change, increase or expansion is both good and bad. Similarly, you know what I mean? Like you can get a lot of money, that can become more money, more problems. You can have a lot of people attracted to you, and that can become a problem. You can okay, so you get the point. Descending node, the moon, when the moon crosses that descending node every month, you're thinking of fortune decreasing. And decrease also was said in the same enigmatic sense. The south node was said to decrease both the good and the bad. And so the south node of the moon is related to Saturn, decrease, privation, wintry conditions, the process of decay and deterioration. So that can be both good and bad. For the Indian astrologers, for example, the south node was considered potentially spiritually auspicious, because when something is decreasing or declining, there's a chance for the ego to decrease or decline. And when the ego is attached to things in the material world, and the material world, the stuff of the world, declines, then the size of the ego, or its attachment, or its illusions that this is all that there is, can also decline. And so there's a kind of a potential for austerity, renunciation, letting go of things that don't serve us or that we're attached to, because of the association with loss or decline. Whereas in Indian astrology, you have to be very careful of the North Node, because the North Node's association with gain is also associated with potential for greater delusion. When you gain things, generally speaking, you can also get deluded into thinking that this is what makes you happy. Here, case in point, there was a story on ESPN this week. Guilty. There's a story on ESPN this week that I saw, and it was a story about a man who was at a bar or something, and he noticed in the fourth quarter of a football game that the odds of the game had changed. The line on the game had changed, and so he placed a bet. And he thought that the odds on the game were it was like if he made a simple bet and it was right, it was going to pay out like $80,000 or something. And it was a really simple bet. It wasn't that much money. Well, the machine had a glitch. The machine had a glitch. So the line was communicated incorrectly. And so even though he won, he was supposed to get $18, not $80,000, but there was a glitch in the machine. So of course now he's hiring an attorney and, trying to get the money or whatever. But just think about that for a second. 10 minutes earlier, the guy was not thinking that he was owed or deserved $80,000 at all, right? Like he would have been like the luckiest guy in the world to suddenly be handed $80,000. But because of a glitch in the system, he suddenly feels that he is entitled to this money. Do you see what I'm saying? The same thing happens to us all the time. When he got it, when he realized that money was taken away from him, he started grasping and clinging and like that. So similarly, the North Node can be about this sense of being, the madness that can come with getting things, because then we really don't want to lose it, Whereas when you lose something and you're faced with the loss, there's an opportunity to really accept, to really just let go on a deeper level, and you can become a humbler, simpler person. Even if it's just a little bit, you can take a step forward in some way when you accept that something has been lost or that something doesn't work. So at any rate, those are some things, esoteric things to think about with the nodes. Why is this important? Because the entire Mars retrograde process has featured the South Node. You see, you have Mars related to desire, will, hunting, going after something, obtaining something that you want. But then when the South Node of the Moon is involved, there is this sense of futility, of meeting with loss, of not being able to get what you need or wish for. And what do you do when that happens? Do you get violent? Do you know what I mean? Mars in the South Node, violence because of frustration of something not working, or because of something deteriorating or declining, or because of limitations, because that's the nature of the South Node. So that just that feeling of frustration, of being confined and hemmed in by something, that's very much a part of Mars in the South Node. So, for example, if you have Mars and it's been in your 10th house of career, and you've had the South Node up there and it's been hanging around, well, then what happens is maybe you go through a period of time where you are trying to make some kind of brave breakthrough in your work, in your professional career. But over this long process that we're talking about, through direct motion, retrograde, back now again, you're going through a period of time where you're trying to make this progress forward, but you feel as though you're being thwarted or limited or closed in and having to deal with things that are constraining or confining. And there's this feeling of frustration and wanting to lash out or wanting to break through, wanting to be more forceful than one should. Those are the kinds of challenges you could feel in your career if all of this was taking place in your career house. Or you could feel it personally with regard to health, or trying to just assert yourself more if it was in your first house. In your 7th house, you could be dealing with it in relationships. In your 4th house, you could be dealing with it in regard to home or family or parents or property. In your 2nd, with finances. In your 3rd, you could be dealing with it mentally or with siblings. In your 5th, maybe with your children or a creative process. In your 6th, it could be the grind of work or illnesses that are hampering you down, or employees that you manage. You know, in your 8th, you could be dealing with shared money issues, or you could be dealing with loss, trauma, death and rebirth themes. In the 9th, it could be spirituality or religion. In the 11th, it could be friends or groups or organizations that you belong to. And in the 12th, you could be dealing with a deep feeling, really deep sort of shadow work in the 12th, or feelings of isolation or loneliness, things like that. You get a feeling. I've just gone through all the houses, but you're thinking about the in a sense, it's like a wounded warrior. It's like your giddy up is having to deal with some constraining or confining circumstances, and probably right about now, everyone's feeling just about done with it on some level, if you've been dealing with this feeling. And not everyone will, because this transit will affect some people more than others, depending on a lot of things that are going on, perhaps, say, in your natal chart. Everybody's karma is unique. But it's very common to be dealing with this feeling of limitation or constraint and frustration. The other thing is the temptation to want to cut through limitations or blockages in a way that's ultimately really unhealthy. Like I mentioned back in June, I did a video called The Astrology of Suicide. And I talked about how Mars in the South Node is often an indication of someone who just says, kind of dumps gasoline on themselves and just lights the match and says, forget it. I'm done with this. I had a feeling yesterday, and I'm going to share it with you guys really openly, just because why not? I think, it's like we're all in this journey together, right? So I was doing something yesterday, and I've been dealing with a cold this week, and right as I was recording something, and it got cut off because the baby was crying downstairs and started interrupting the recording really loudly. And I was about 35 minutes into about an hour-long recording that I was trying to make. And I realized that as the sound, if you have a baby, like the sound of your own baby crying is very difficult to get any work done, during. So I was trying to get it done, but I was going off track in the recording I was making, and it was really distracting. And I deleted the video. And afterward, I had this really honest thought in my head, which was that I wish this is an honest moment. I wish I could just delete my life sometimes. Not literally, like I don't think about taking my own life or anything like that. But you ever have one of those moments where you're just like, where's the reset button? Can I just press reset? Because everything feels so chaotic, and I was sick and like, trying to work through a lot of different kinds of conditions simultaneously that felt like they were all pressing in on me. And I was just like, where can I press the reset button? And I realized afterward, I just had this moment. I was like, wow, that was such a Mars South Node moment. And it happens to be in my career house right now. So, so I've been doing a lot of hard work with work-related stuff for a while, preparing for the birth of our child and so forth. So it's been a really, really busy time for me, and one where I've been having to do a lot of stuff that's not like my top creative priorities in my work life. And I was so frustrated with it all yesterday, and I in my head, I was like, can I just press the reset button? Well, luckily, I went for, and I recognized very quick, I was like, wow, that's so Mars South Node. Went for a walk with my wife last night. I think my mom's here right now helping out. And so my wife and I took a walk last night, and I was telling her about how I was feeling or whatever. And you realize one of the things that we don't talk a lot about with Mars retrograde, Mars South Node is how important it is to have someone in your life that you can share your frustrations with. So if there's anything I could, like, any remedy that's really good for the kind of astrological moment we're going through with Mars right now, it's to find someone who you can tell or speak in honesty about your frustrations with, who's not going to judge you for being frustrated, who's not going to judge you for being irritated or agitated. In a sense, there's just maybe a little bit of fuming that has to happen right now, and that's okay. It's much better than trying to take some kind of really drastic action that could, harm yourself or harm your relationships or whatever. So this feeling of constraint, confinement, austerity is also good for simplifying, for purifying, for reducing down to what is essential, to illuminating for us the importance of, cutting away what's excessive. And this can be something that happens mentally. It can be something that happens in your relationships or at work. So take the moment to, your frustration or wherever your edge is taking you right now, see it as a sign of, first of all, just validate your frustrations and find a way to have them validated by others. Because otherwise the potential is to turn it inward and to really fume and like that. And see it as a sign of where you may need to cut something out or reduce or simplify or let go of something. Mars in the South Node is a great image of, for example, a cyst being removed or something toxic being, cut out or released. There is some sense of removal. I want to share with you guys something else. I just literally sitting down before I started this talk today, I got a text message from my father letting me know that he and his partner are going to be moving to another state. What that means, translation, is that they will be probably letting go of the land and my grandfather's home, which my father inherited and lives in, and the land that I grew up going to, which is fine. It's not like any, this is something I've kind of sensed was coming for a while. But that, that struck me right away as like, oh, that's very Mars South Node. My father's an Aquarius, by the way. That's very Mars South Node in the sense of there being a cutting of the cord, so the ancestral property, land, and memories associated with my grandfather's place probably will not be there again, right? They're probably gone now. That's a Mars South Node kind of moment. And in a sense, there's a sense of loss, and it's tempting, it's tempting to be frustrated by such things, right? To be frustrated by moments of loss or relinquishing something. But there's great release also in letting things go, because when things in this world, as you know, have a way of filling in. As soon as there's a space, something fills into that space pretty quickly. So I'm always interested in trying to figure out a way of maintaining the space that's created when some kind of removal comes in. Like something is removed, and a lot of the times we rush to fill it with something. We rush to fill it with anger, frustration, something new, creating something new, some new intention. Well, what good will come from this? Well, what's the silver lining? And another thing that we have in front of us is that oftentimes it's the space or the gap that if we leave it there and let it be there and let it exist, something grows out of it of its own accord, and we don't have to fill it with something right away. So a lot of the times in ancient texts, there are what are called lacunas, which are basically like gaps, like missing, missing portions of ancient manuscripts or something like that. And there's sort of a blank space. And a lot of the times, scholars, well, especially in ancient astrology, will rush to fill it in. Like, what was in that lacuna? What did the text say? What was it here to teach us? What was the ancient doctrine? Like, what was it? Or, what did the author really mean? We don't know. There's a part of the text missing. Okay, well, then we have to, like that. Similarly, in dreams, some nights we dream and we will go very deeply into a dream space. And then when we try to recall it the next day, we remember parts of it, but there's missing pieces. There's lacunas all over in trying to recall a dream. And one of the things I've learned over and over again, and I got this in part from James Hillman, who spoke a lot about lacunas and missing pieces and texts and dreams and memories and things like that, is that it's those places that are missing. It's when there's a hole that comes in and we let it be what it is, but we keep coming back to it. Like it's a cavern or an abyss that we allow ourselves to be drawn to and to look into and what's in there. But we don't demand anything from it. Just allow that empty space to be there. And then things start coming out. And I found that in my daily life, it's very important to trust those moments as well. For example, when there's a dead space and I feel I've been working, and then suddenly I hit a moment where I feel nothing. I feel numb. I don't want to do work. I'm like dead. I'm whatever. Usually the temptation is to go into, like inner turmoil about it. Well, what should I be doing? I am such a slacker, or I want to be productive. And then in order to rebel against the guilt, you go and you eat something, or, like this, we end up filling that space rather than just looking into it. And a lot of the times when we slow down enough to recognize when some space just cavernously opens up in front of us, that there's immediately, there's something about the attraction to that space, that gap or that void. So think about that, because Mars is the kind of planet that will always rush to action for the most part. And when it's confronting the South Node, it's confronting that kind of wintry gap, that deterioration space, or that decay space, or that limiting space. There's knowledge in there. There's wisdom. There's messages. There's omens. There's guidance from the divine. There's all sorts of magical things waiting in that space. But we have to override the temptation to say, just reset. Just let me reset this. I hate the whole thing. Why is it like that? Like, just to meet that space with such frustration or feeling of such blockage. So that's my message for today about Mars retrograde. Now, as promised, we're going to turn our attention to Venus retrograde. Or that was my message about Mars in the South Node. Now we're going to turn our attention to Venus retrograde. Now, this is sort of a sneak preview of a sneak preview, because I'm going to be dealing with Venus retrograde a few more times. But the focus of today is really, how should you prepare for Venus retrograde? What's to come with Venus retrograde? Well, Venus turns retrograde in Scorpio October 6th, will be retrograde in Scorpio all the way till November 16th or 17th, at which point it turns direct again. It'll be turning direct in Libra, so it's a Scorpio Libra kind of theme. I'm going to focus mostly today on the Scorpio part because that's where it spends the bulk of its time. So first of all, let's review on Venus. What does Venus represent? Venus represents health, beauty, and cleanliness, desire, lust, fun, beauty, performance, the arts, costume, pageantry, style, dress, appearance, vanity, sex, love, harmony, friendship, accord, agreement. That's a pretty good list of Venetian symbolism. Now, one thing that's very important to remember about Venus is, as soon as Venus is born, out of the foam, one of the names that she carries is phosphorus, and she's sort of a phosphorescent light. Does anybody know the etymological roots of the word phosphorescent? I'm going to read it to you right now in case you don't. I had it pulled up, but hold on, here it is. A substance or organism that shines of itself, light-bringing, also the morning star. Torchbearer, light or daylight, to carry and also to bear children. Those are some of the etymological roots of the word phosphorus. But the one that I really like is a substance or organism that shines of itself. One of the things that can be very tricky about Venus is that Venus symbolizes love, right? But Venus in Greek/Roman mythology, Aphrodite, is a goddess who remains complete unto herself and isn't one to go around needing or wanting like a prince. It's a very important detail about Venus that we often overlook, because what does our modern world really tell us about love? Like, what's the modern story that we tell ourselves about love? We tell ourselves, for the most part, that the pinnacle of happiness is a romantic, satisfying, enduring, happily ever after kind of love story, which is exceedingly rare in this world, and many people end up being deeply disappointed when they find out that relationships, for the most part, don't conform to that story. That's not to say that love or a lifetime of committed partnership is not possible, but it's not that kind of happily ever after story for the most part. We grow old, we witness each other dying, we go through disease and suffering, we go through sharing each other's karma and family karma, we go through differences of philosophy, differences of belief, differences of interest. We are on the same page, and then suddenly we're not, or we're interested in very different things. We go through so much change as everything is changing here in the material world that it becomes very difficult to fulfill this kind of romantic image of everything working out that way, that romantic, happily ever after kind of way. Similarly, we also have an image of ourselves. We have an image of ourselves that we promote as being in the perfect relationship with yourself. And this is something that is a part of modern psychology that has its roots in some ways in the same kind of romantic notion, happily ever after, and meeting the prince or the princess or whatever. The idea is that nowadays, what does the happily ever after look like in terms of one's relationship with oneself? I'm happy, I'm healthy, I'm balanced, I love myself. and this same idea that the marriage with yourself and the marriage with yourself and the life you're living and the way you're reflecting upon the life you're living and like that, this is also potentially very distorting. And okay, because for example, most of us have very turbulent relationships with ourselves. As Jim Carrey said recently, he said depression is a sign that your avatar is tired of the role that it's been playing. Your avatar wants to play a different role, and because you'll get depressed. A lot of the times we're method acting our lives in all different kinds of roles that we never question. We just think that's who I am. And then when changes come along, it's very difficult to accept. We go into crisis, identity crisis, and we all different kinds of changes, and we try to endure them and be graceful about them and be like self-effacing and humorous and sarcastic and clever, and we try to roll with the interchanges and the way that our method acting is going in the world. And like if you're kind of like you're just as proud of a happy marriage in this world, like the idyllic marriage, as you are of the perfect inner life. And Venus takes on a lot of that in astrology. Like in modern astrology, when we talk about Venus, we're often talking about how, Venus is love, and so immediately Venus becomes about your relationship and the desire for that kind of happiness that we believe is the happily ever after romance. Or Venus is used in terms of self-esteem. You'll hear people talking about how do you love yourself, and Venus is your style and your this kind of inner feeling of being valuable. And how many times do I hear people in all different kinds of settings in astrology say, well, you're not going to find your partner until you really love yourself. See, it's like your inner marriage has to be right before your outer marriage can ever happen. So if you're not getting one, it's because you really don't love yourself, or it'll be something like that. Both of which are just, impossible things to achieve in this world. So the point is that Venus as a goddess has little to do with either of these ideals. There is something about Venus that remains very elusive, and in many ways Venus acts as a covering. Venus as for example, when Venus is born on the waves, she's called phosphorus, self-illuminated, but she's immediately covered. And she's immediately covered and adorned and ornamented. Similarly, the soul, when we come into a body, is covered in the layers of a body. And we're adorned and ornamented with the stuff of our body. And similarly, throughout the life that we lead, we are adorned and covered in the costumes of the roles that we play. And those roles are personal. They're about literally the costumes we wear, but also the costumes we act out in terms of personality and social character and things like that. They're the roles, the stagecraft that we're utilizing. Similarly, they represent not so much, Venus represents not so much our relationships, but the kind of covering and beautiful adornment of our relationships, the way in which you could characterize or qualify or describe the relationships. But remember that Venus herself is a self-possessed goddess. She's a self-illuminated being. And so she is, who's like that as a god is Mars. Mars is not someone who's seeking some kind of fulfillment in a sense outside of himself, and yet he's also clothed in the articles of war. But that's not really who Mars is either. These are like external trappings of a deeper teaching that's going on with both planets. So, for example, when you get to another great example for Venus, of understanding Venus, more on Mars a different time. When you think about Venus, her association was also with the cleanliness of temples. The cleanliness in the inside of a temple is necessary. So you have to clean the temple. There's a certain way that everything is laid out very perfectly. The candles are arranged in a certain way. The flowers are put out in a certain way. The food is offered and prepared in a certain way. Everything's done in a certain way. But why? Is it that those external things matter? No. It's that the self-illumined being, Venus, right? We'll just use Venus in this case. The self-illumined being, Phosphorus, that self-illumined being has to be covered in things, is adorned with things, because it's so beautiful, it's so bright, it's so lovely, that we have to try to hold it or put things around it. Its essence is juxtaposed with what its context is, with what we surround it by. That's why to bring the deity through the altar, to bring the spirit through the altar, it has to be adorned. That's Venus's job in the temple, not because she's just superficial stuff, but because she points to the relationship of harmonizing inner essence with the external surroundings. Inner essence with external surroundings. So all of that has to be known about Venus before we can really get into what Venus is going to, what does Venus retrograde mean? You have to get beyond thinking about just relationships and love and what I'm going to get, the perfect relationship is going to make me happy, or like the perfect set of clothing that's going to make me happy, or whatever. No, those things may come up. Relationships may come up. Your wardrobe may come up. Your beauty products may come up, right? Your body may come up. But all of that is the trappings of the decorations of the altar. And what we're really trying to get to is that inner illumined being. That's what Venus is really pointing to. All the planets, by the way, in different ways, point to spirit. They're helping us as guideposts back to soul and back to our original divine source. So when Venus is doing this, when Venus has this sense of being like, who are you really? What are you really? And we're like, well, I guess I'm going to be a shoemaker, I guess I'm going to be an astrologer. I guess I'm going to be a, whatever, computer programmer. All we're doing is manipulating the external circumstances. But what we really want to do, and what a Venus retrograde offers us an opportunity to do, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, is to get down into the essence of things. And when we get down into the essence of things and we boil down to that point, there, in that kind of that space, the knowledge of that space gives us the intelligence to then come out and maybe make some changes in the externals, change the decorations on the altar, make adjustments in the external space. That's what a Venus retrograde provides us with an opportunity to do. But if we do it in reverse, if we say, well, I'll make external changes and hope that gives me the perfect marriage with myself, I'll make external changes and hopefully that gets me the guy or the girl. Or if it's like that, it won't work. That's why don't make changes under Venus retrogrades is a true adage if you're thinking of Venus as only the external adornments and decorations, rather than understanding that when Venus is born, she is adorned. It's a totally different kind of understanding. So, when Venus turns retrograde, the general things that happen are like this. In order to get to the inner essence of the way that you as a soul are relating, Venus is a planet of relating, to others, to yourself, to your work, to your environment, however you relate to anything, Venus will potentially weaken things in the external world. We'll start breaking them down or making them fall apart because there is some discord that's being highlighted between, let's say, inner essence and external circumstances. There's disharmony. So when Venus turns retrograde, relationships can break down, your sense of taste, style, or social behavior can be analyzed or broken down. You can be called out for the way that you act in public or in social situations or in relationships. You can start not liking the clothing that you have or the way that you look. You can start, right? So this kind of stuff starts to happen. The other thing that can happen is health. Venus is related to cleanliness and health. So health and cleanliness can start to break down. They can start to fall apart. The message behind that, of course, is all of these different kinds of breakdowns that can happen in health, cleanliness, hygiene, agreements, friendships, social behavior, relationships. All these things can start breaking apart or falling apart, or you can have the desire to make changes to them. But why is all of it happening? Again, the idea is that it's all happening to help you tune back into your essence. What's honest? What's real about who you are? And it's not that everything in the material world is fake or false and all just superficial. But often we forget that we are not, our inner essence is alive and itself is changing. So as our spirit soul evolves, changes, grows, its desires, its needs also change and grow. And when that happens, we come back in touch with that self-effulgent beingness that we are. We get in touch with what we really want, what we really desire, and then the context can change. But be careful, because the first part of the process in a Venus retrograde is often we see the things that are falling apart, and what do? Just like I was talking about with Mars, we rush to fill the gap. Oh, well, I'll just do this, or I'll do that, or I'll make this kind of change or that kind of change, and just try to put a Band-Aid over it. You can't, you can paint rust any color you want. It's still rust underneath. A deeper kind of substantive alchemical transformation is needed to get something rusty out and something shiny and smooth back in. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of change that we're looking for. So I have some things written down here on a list. You could go through style or image changes, a reconfiguration of values in relationships, social settings, social behavior, sexuality, in terms of what you need, want, or desire, in terms of like material appetites or hungers. All of these kinds of changes, I want you to think about as the temptation to immediately change those and think that you have the problem answered is akin to just, changing the stuff around on an altar without having any intention of connecting to the spirit that fills the altar. So what we need to do is, as the deterioration happens, come inward, allow for the space to be filled naturally and very gradually. Don't push it, don't rush it, don't try to, commandeer the, you know what I mean? Like, don't push an agenda, because the reason that things are falling apart is because you've lost touch with something essential. And that something essential needs room to speak, needs room to emerge. Venus isn't like Venus is very organic. How do you get Venus to come to you? You find things that she likes, right? What does like mean? It doesn't mean superficial. It means really like. This is hard because we live in a day and age where the cheapest, simplest way of doing what you feel you should socially is to give the thumbs up, the like button. You know what I mean? But real inner like, it's deeper. It takes a little bit. You have to really be present to know what you really like. And that's actually the patience that's needed to attract Venus. The soul is a lover. The soul's natural desire is to love and be loved, to connect and attach to things. And so in order to address the needs and love of the soul, you have to listen, and we have to like you would Venus, if you're trying to court a lover, you have to discover what they like and present slowly, very gradually with things that are attractive. And that's how the soul is drawn out too. So Venus retrograde gives us a process of getting in touch with what the soul actually desires and wants and needs. But it has to be slow. It has to be gentle, and it has to have a sense of, try something, like present something to yourself and then think about it. Okay. Do I like that? Sit with it a little bit. No, I don't. Okay. No harm. No one was trying to force anything here. And then something else. Okay. And like that. So Venus retrograde process is a great time to revise lots of different things in your life. But to do so through getting in touch with your inner essence requires patience, and it requires the kind of the erotics of drawing out your own inner Venus. That's an aspect, you could say, of it's like it's a portal through which we get to know the soul, Venus. So Mars has a different approach. You know what I mean? If you want to get to know the soul through Mars, it's a totally different situation. Okay, so that's some stuff about Venus. Now, you got other things that can come up specifically because of the sign that Venus is in. And this is where things get a little tricky, because Venus is going to be retrograde in her detriment or exile in Scorpio, which is the sign of Mars. It's a feminine water sign of Mars. But this is a tricky place for Venus, because here Venus wants to be more forceful, more aggressive, more Mars-like. And that's tricky. It's tricky to figure out how to do that. So it's easy to come on too strong. It's easy to be too drastic, too severe, too intense. It's easy to basically, it's basically, you can very easily ignore the slowness of the process and drawing something essential out of the process because of the impulsiveness, rashness, recklessness, combativeness of Scorpio, all of which can be very good things in many different kinds of contexts in many different ways. But Venus in Scorpio, can be very challenging to figure out how to do that. So, for example, you can deal with things like betrayal, jealousy, lust, worry, paranoia, all of these kind of conflicted, really deep kind of conflicted elements in love and relationships. Why? Because you're trying to change something. You're trying to create some kind of change, let's say, in a relationship, or you're trying to get down to something essential. But there's also a sense of urgency, or a sense of danger, or there's a sense of threat, or there's a sense of something lurking beneath the surface that you don't feel right about. That's the Mars quality. That's the danger and the hunt and the thrill and the fight and the protect and the defend. And so when you're trying to get down to the essence of something, and there's also those kinds of conflicted Mars-like elements, it can be very challenging. Sometimes, in other words, to get down to the essence of something in Venus retrograde means getting down to the essence of the truth of something. And it's where we don't want to look at the truth because it's conflicting, or there's confrontation involved, or there's jealousy or betrayal. We don't want to admit that we've done something, or we don't want to admit that we want something. So we hide, or we're secretive. But getting down to the essence of what Venus wants, what kinds of changes are trying to happen, is a little bit tricky when there's those Mars elements involved. So there can be a little bit more contentiousness in a Venus retrograde like this one. It's not uncommon to see a little bit more, like this. It's a little bit more like a soap opera with Venus retrograde in Scorpio, because it's very emotional. It's very serious. It can be very intense and transformative and cathartic, because it's got those deep emotional and also potentially somewhat passive for Mars. So there's a kind of potential for a more clandestine feeling thinking of like spies and, like the I'm thinking of James. I think there's a new James Bond movie coming out. I just read somewhere today. The James, the classical like James Bond, like falling in love with a spy, and like, can they trust one another? Are they double crossing each other? It's like, all of that. There's also getting down to the inner truth of something when we'd rather just keep everything nice and harmonious, right? Everything's fine the way it is. We don't have to get down to anything. That can be a conflict for Venus and Scorpio. There's only so much we can hold back before it all erupts. And that's the other thing to remember with Venus retrograde in Scorpio, is that there are things that may need to surface, essential truths to get in touch with, and the way that they come out might be messy. It might not be beautiful. It might be a little yucky or ugly. So you can also see deals or agreements breaking down because of betrayals of trust. You can see being deceived or deceiving, manipulating or being manipulated. And again, one of the issues, or one of the reasons for this, is that water signs were traditionally called mute, and they have a more secretive quality, traditionally speaking. They're subtler, and yet there's an element of aggression and of danger, conflict, and discord with a Mars-ruled sign. Again, all of which serves a purpose in life, but when you put Venus in there in retrograde, the way that things break apart or change or shift can be, there can be a sense of deterioration and not going, it's painful potentially and combative, but not necessarily as direct as you would get from, say, Mars and Aries. It's the Mars quality of Scorpio can be a little bit more passive, and that's where you get some of the intrigue and drama and like that. Okay. So let me see. Going through the list. One thing that's kind of interesting you can note is if you go back to the fall of 2010, that was the last time that we had a Venus retrograde in Scorpio. So you can also compare what is my experience like now and what was it like back in 2010. Sometimes themes will repeat from one time and place to another. There can be repeating themes, and that doesn't mean that exactly the same thing is going to happen, but usually because it's falling in the same whole sign house in your chart, or it's the same area of topics, the idea is that similar kinds of archetypal themes may come up. So look at Scorpio in your chart, especially the first 10 degrees, see where those first 10 degrees of Scorpio are located, and you might have a sense of what kind of topics are going to be associated. Remember that it turns retrograde on October 6th. It goes to November 16th or 17th. Remember, the Venus phosphorus is a self-illumined being. Another thing to note, just as an aside, is that in Greek mythology, Aphrodite is desired by, everyone. Like, everyone wants her, but there's more of an aloofness on her side. She's not as, you know what I mean? And it's very important because one of the real teachings of most spiritual traditions is that the soul itself, though a lover, is also somewhat aloof, though beautiful and brilliantly attractive, blissful, etc., is also somewhat aloof. So yoga teaches this, Buddhism teaches this. When you get in touch with that essentialness, there is a sense of your soul, your spirit soul, being self-illumined, blissful, eternal, knowledgeable, and yet it doesn't need the external circumstances, right? It's not in need of any of them. So, for example, gurus in the East are adorned with flowers, and their followers surround them by holy, beautiful things. Just like if you go see Amma, the hugging saint, she's surrounded and adorned by adoring followers. and she's adorned constantly. But Amma herself, if you ever just notice her energy, she's aloof. She's self-effulgent in a sense and just sort of aloof. And gurus are like that too. If you've ever met, if you see people like Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama, adorned and yet in something so attractive, but that inner essence is not hankering after things, is not in need of anything external. That's Venus. That's really the essence of Venus. And that's why Venus has this very esoteric relationship to religious ceremony and religious ritual and temples and the clean space of the cleanliness associated with religion and the adornment associated with temples or holy people. There's something self-effulgent about her. So just remember that, because that's if you keep on that track, then whatever changes need to come in around you, it really won't be the point. The Venus retrograde ultimately is about helping you find that self-effulgent beauty. And the externals that change around then will happen naturally. So that's my message for today about Venus retrograde. I hope that this was interesting for everybody. I am going to this is interesting. So there's some questions and comments I'm going to field in the box here. I'm going to start from the most recent. Lisa says, you can look, but you can't touch. A very lonely place. Yes, that's possible, that there is some kind of lonely, there's some sense of loneliness there. But I also think that you can see it as the Venetian sort of self-effulgent. You can, one of the reasons that I think the real definition of self-effulgent is not like that definition of happy with yourself. You know what I mean? Like, oh, I'm so self-actualized. I have such a good relationship with myself. All of my ducks are in a row. I feel so great about everything. That's not what we're talking about, which I do believe would be very lonely, actually. Just like a partnership that's based on false notions of romantic perfection is actually very lonely. But rather, the idea of the self-effulgence is where one also begins to see that everything in the world is a covering of the same exact self-effulgent light. And when you see that, you're never alone. So I think that's the way that I would choose to see that. Because you're the same essence that is self-effulgent in you, and your spirit soul is the same in all sentient beings, and therefore there's a communion that's present, and it's a bit of a paradox. All right, let's go up. I feel like a hot mess when I'm not staying in tune with eternal purpose and stay somewhat detached. I have to be okay with things not looking good on the outside and hold things I love with an open hand. Yes, very good. I think that's a good description of sort of spiritual Venus. Thank you, guys. Some really nice comments here. Thanks for the coverings for beauty, spirit, explanations of Venus, Mars, etc., directing to soul. Oh, good. Like Chinese medicine, everything supports the heart. Discerning between anxiety and fear. There is happiness outside of the happily ever after ideal. Yes, there's a happily ever after before and after the happily ever after story, you know? So, but what do we consume? We consume entertainment all the time that's telling that story, you know? Oh, thank you. Thank you, Michael. That's a nice comment. To validate one's frustrations, express it, going back to Mars now, allowing missing pieces we can return to undemandingly. Yes, yeah, very important. Ra says, frustrated? Who's frustrated? I'm not frustrated. I'll leave out the swear word. Anyway, yeah, so that's what I have for today. I don't see any other questions. We'll be looking at this a few more times. Yeah. Oh, this is an interesting comment. When I think of Venus and Scorpio, the words are whatever Lola wants, she gets. Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I mean, first of all, we're not hating on Venus and Scorpio at all. Venus in Scorpio, as one of my viewers pointed out the other day, is about getting down to what is authentic, what's real, even if it requires some element of conflict or shadow work. Hey, that's not a bad Venus. It's just that's a level of work subjectively that most people don't like as much as, other Venus positions. Not that any Venus retrograde is necessarily easy. It's just that that particular Venus position requires a little bit more of the uncomfortable kind of work. So subjectively, we say she's in her exile. She's in a place where it's a little bit rougher. But that rough work can be of the best kind of work. So we shouldn't think about these things in a shallow way. The language of essential dignities is esoteric language that's meant to enhance our understanding of the type of karmic work or season that's unfolding in our lives. So we have to use it in that way. Hillary says, when we get to the heart of Venus, she seems all the more compatible with Virgo, her fall. There's, again, there's the other dignity of Venus. When Venus is in Virgo, of course, she's contending with Mercury, who's more in a more dry, earthy sign, and it's more analytical, and that can be very challenging for Venus. If you've ever tried to set up an altar space, if you've ever tried to cook a meal and set it out, and you're in your flow, you're singing, you're whistling, you're kind of like moving in the space, and someone comes in and they're like, let me just go through this list of things. Are you doing this? Did you add that? Let me do this. And you're just like, you're ruining I'm creating a whirlpool of goodness in here, right? And you're coming in and like there's too much sporadic, like choppy energy. And in a sense, that's why Venus struggles in Virgo, because there's more of a dry and analytical energy that's there. And so it's just harder for Venus to get into her flow, you could say, in that space. But again, sometimes Venus loves to be in a nice flow, and she's not paying attention to any of the details. You know what I mean? So essentially, a lot of the times our life, for example, Venus Virgo, retrograde in Virgo, you could be all about where you have to go through the frustrating process of looking at the details that you don't want to look at. But those details lead you down to that problem of inner essence. You're not living in alignment with inner essence because you're not paying attention to the details. That would be an example of that'd be more challenging probably. So again, these are just brief treatments to give you an idea. It's a courageous Venus, someone says. Yeah, or potentially avoidant. It could go either way, or drama producing or provoking. It could go that way too. It can. I'm always careful to overly simplify. Like some people don't will say like, oh, I don't want Venus in Scorpio to be like negative or bad, so she's a warrior. She's so awesome. She's a warrior. I'm like, yeah, but that's true maybe like 40% of the time. You know what I mean? Otherwise, there's all sorts of other things that might come out with Venus in Scorpio. So I'm always careful to just not whitewash anything difficult or to make anything overly negative. Sort of stay hugging the flexibility of the archetypes. I'm a Scorpio with Venus rising. This is my life. Gotcha. Jane says, going back to Mars and that idea of empty space, sometimes the hardest thing to do is to do nothing and wait. Yeah, so agree with you there. Okay, well, that's what I've got for you guys today. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope you guys have a great week. We will be back again probably in the next few days, maybe for a weekend astrology update. Okay, take care, guys. Bye.